It's great to be here. I want to thank the president of Union Theological Seminary, Serene Jones, for her leadership. And I'm just very proud that Union is continuing to stay on the cutting edge, doing this important work. I have great memories of matriculating through these halls as a student. My academic advisor, the incomparable Professor James Cone, is in the audience. I don't know how that makes me feel, but it's good to see you, Dr. Cone. Once his student, always his student. And I'm very clear about that. But it's good to see Professor Cone and Professor Tom Driver and his wife, and we went to Haiti together and spent 2 weeks together in the country of Haiti while I was a student. To Larry Cox, who I've gotten to know over the last several years. I think Larry's moving around here somewhere, but we worked very hard together on the Troy Davis death penalty case, and I come with a great deal of respect for his work with Amnesty International, and he's just an indefatigable fighter for human rights. Liz Thea Harris, thank you for your leadership. And my good friend, the Reverend Kathleen Baker, is somewhere here, and I'm grateful for her work with Union's Poverty Initiative several years ago. All of these currents now coming together for the important work we have ahead. Sharon Rebar, if you're ever in Atlanta on a Sunday morning, I have a slot for you to sing right before the sermon. Thank you so very much for your leadership and the great spirit that you bring to this work. I want to talk about black theology, the black church, and America's prison industrial complex. Emerging in the historical context of the civil rights and black power movements, black theology came to voice as an important theological affirmation of the humanity of the oppressed, and as a radical response to racism, America's original sin, and its most persistent and intractable evil. Indeed, racism's intractability and stunning resourcefulness as a socio-political virus capable of presenting itself first as institutionalized slavery, then mutating in the post-Reconstruction era into Jim Crow segregation and other manifestations of re-enslavement, can be accounted for in large measure by its sacralization through deep contradictions and glaring omissions in the theological reflections of white theologians, pastors, and the churches they represent. That is why black theology is so important in the history of theological discourse and American Christianity. Nascent black theologians asked, how could white theologians in their orthodox, liberal, and neo-orthodox variations speak credibly about a loving and just God while refusing to address themselves and their work to the doctrine of white supremacy and its social manifestations in slavery and in segregation? How could they be so silent about something so central and so tragically consequential in American life? Martin Luther King Jr., whose movement did more than anything else to provide a larger context ripe for the emergence of the black theology movement, had already hinted at this epistemological problem inherent to the religion of the Christians who opposed his movement for freedom and human fulfillment. Writing from a Birmingham jail, he argues or asks, on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship there? Who is their God? In his landmark text, God of the Oppressed, Black theologian James Cone proffers an answer to King's fundamental question, accounting for the failure of theologians and pastors to address the deepest of American contradictions in this way. Cone says the history of white American theology illustrates the concept of the social a priori asserted by Werner Stark and the other sociologists of knowledge. The social environment, he says, functions as a mental grid, deciding what will be considered as relevant data in a given inquiry. For example, because white theologians are not the sons and daughters of black slaves, but the descendants of white slave masters, their theological grid automatically excludes from the field of perception the data of Richard Allen, Henry Highland Garnett, Nathaniel Paul, David Walker, and Henry McNeil Turner. This same axiological grid accounts for the absence of the apocalyptic expectations of the spirituals among the so-called hope theologians. And the same explanation can be given why the white existentialists do not say anything about absurdity in the blues. It is obvious that because white theologians were not enslaved and lynched and are not ghettoized because of color, they do not think that color is an important point of departure for theological discourse, thus giving voice to those on the underside of slavery and segregation as they asserted themselves in the expression Black Power and embodied institutionally in the NCBC, the National Committee of Black Churchmen, an organization of pastors and academic theologians working together to define the parameters of an emerging discourse. Black theology, nascent black theology, emerged as the people's apologia, a living theology walking riot-torn streets and standing in the gap between Jerusalem and Athens, ivory towers and ebony trenches. Yet when one considers this history, it is all the more remarkable and lamentable that black and womanist theologians who are writing today and who see justice-making as central to the meaning of the gospel have had so very little to say about the theological implications of the socio-political virus of racism as it has mutated in its clearest and perhaps most consequential manifestation for black communities in America today: mass incarceration. To be sure, notwithstanding a burgeoning black middle class in the decades since the Civil Rights Movement and extraordinary examples of upward mobility and achievement facilitated by the breaking down of many barriers, the masses of African American people are still mired in a complex web of problems that makes the disaggregation of any single issue difficult, and some may argue purely academic. Moreover, womanist thought has done much to illumine the multidimensional character of all oppression. But while recognizing the structural complexity of racism and its inextricable link to and participation with other constituent parts of hegemonic power, including sexism, classism, and militarism, I would argue that today, mass incarceration is Jim Crow's most obvious descendant, and like its ancestor, its dismantling would represent not only substantive social transformation, but immeasurable transvaluative power in a society still bent on worshiping whiteness. I will present the evidence in support of my argument below. But a critical question guiding this inquiry is: how is it that black churches, the historical conscience of the American churches, and black and womanist theologies as liberationist theologies have yet to focus and find their public voice on the one social issue most steeped in the heretical doctrine of white supremacy, inasmuch as America's so-called justice system is the one area of the society that is many times more rabidly racist than anything imaginable during the Civil Rights era, with tragic consequences for black families and black communities. In some ways, one might well argue that America's current system of disproportionately sentencing and stigmatizing scores of black people in its so-called war on drugs is as dehumanizing and destructive as slavery itself, as we shall see both represent, in many cases, a kind of life sentence. Yet so far, neither black churches nor black theologians have marshaled their institutional and intellectual resources in a way commensurate with the magnitude of this moral and humanitarian crisis. The question is, why not? In view of first-generation black theologian James Cone's observation about white theology in an earlier era, I ask, in this era, is there something about the social environment of black theology and the mental grid of the black church that has rendered both mute with what Dwight Hopkins and others call stammering tongues when it comes to the most stigmatized people of color in America today, black men and women warehoused in our nation's prison industrial complex? Could it be that both the black church and black theology are hampered in their respective vocations of meaningful social praxis and relevant critical reflection by their alienation from one another and by the fact that neither lives close enough to this human rights problem that plagues the poorest of the poor for it to enter in a sustained way into its field of perception and praxis? Has privilege, ecclesial and academic, left black pastors and black theologians blind or paralyzed or both? In view of their own history and vocation, how should black theology and the black churches think about the problem of mass incarceration? Michelle Alexander has persuasively argued that the mass incarceration of tens of thousands of black men for nonviolent drug-related offenses and the lifelong consequences that result are constituent parts of the new Jim Crow. I agree. There is no clearer example of America's unfinished business with the project of racial justice in a putatively post-racial era than the 21st century caste system engendered by its prison industrial complex. Moreover, I submit that there is no more significant scandal belying the moral credibility and witness of all of the American churches than their conspicuous silence as this human rights catastrophe has unfolded over the last 3 decades. The United States of America is unrivaled in the sheer size and magnitude of its prison population, warehousing about 1/4 of the world's prisoners, although Americans only account for about 5% of the world's population. For many years now, prison construction and maintenance, a major economic engine for many towns and rural communities, has had little or nothing to do with actual crime rates. In all of the large American cities, half of the young black men, are caught up somewhere in the matrix and control of the criminal justice system, or hampered in their social mobility or civic participation, or hampered in their social involvement or civic participation by the social stigma of a criminal record. Most of them are charged with nonviolent drug-related offenses and are casualties in America's so-called war on drugs. Ironically, having circulated through the criminal justice system and stigmatized as a convicted felon, they come out only to be confronted with all of the legalized barriers against which Martin Luther King Jr. and those who battled the old Jim Crow fought, including discrimination in housing, employment, voting, some professional licenses. There are some states where you can't even be a barber because you went to jail. Public benefits and student loans. Legally barred from the doors of entry to citizenship, symbolized in the right to vote, and denied access to human dignity and ladders of opportunity and social upward mobility. Those who have served their time in America's prison, or for many of our young men and women who plead guilty in exchange for little or no actual prison time, are often condemned to eternal social damnation. They are not part of a class, but a permanent caste system of political pariahs or economic lepers, condemned in a very real sense to check a box on applications for employment and other applications reminiscent of the ancient biblical stigma, unclean. Given the sheer magnitude and broad implications of this assault on black people's humanity and their ability to sustain viable communities, one might characterize the quietude and lack of mobilization in all of the American churches, but black churches and among black liberation theologians in particular, as something akin to what the latter labeled in an earlier era of the 20th century, the de-radicalization of the black church. The truth is, black theologians have been no more responsive in the actual content of their critical reflections and work on the prison industrial complex and the mass incarceration sweeping black communities than were conservative, politically disengaged black pastors during the era of lynching and Jim Crow segregation. How does one account for the de-radicalization of second-generation black theology and the black church? Since we do not ourselves face severely repressive tactics of domination and intimidation like lynching, the question is, why have we black pastors and theologians been so silent and disengaged on this issue, which represents for our generation what slavery and Jim Crow segregation represented for earlier generations? I suggest several reasons. Neither the black church nor black theology has put forth a clear theological voice and moral witness on the subject of mass incarceration and its human rights implications in the 21st century. To be sure, scores of black churches have prison ministries, and some even have reclamation ministries for formerly incarcerated individuals. But there is a vast difference between offering pastoral care and spiritual guidance to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated and challenging the public policies, laws, and policing practices that lead to the disproportionate incarceration of people of color in the first place. The relative absence of black church praxis and critical black theological speech around the glaring political contradictions of mass incarceration can be attributed to at least three things. Like a good Baptist preacher, 3 points, and then I'll sit down. Number one, a sharp emphasis upon privatistic piety rather than social transformation in black churches. Number two, the social and moral stigma attached to the issue of crime, the drug trade, and those involved. And three, the divide between black theology and the black church. Privatistic piety. Black churches, for reasons of history and theology, a church with a divided mind, as I argue in my book that is released, by the way, today. Go get it, it's on Amazon. It is a church with a divided mind. Shaped by the evangelical fervor of the period of the Great Awakenings and other similar revivalistic movements, its proclamation has posited the theological sensibilities of a profoundly privatistic piety, emphasizing the freedom of the individual soul. On the other hand, because it was formed within the context of the American slavocracy and born fighting for freedom, the black church has also embodied in its proclamation and demonstrated through its praxis a prominent theme of political protest aimed at the biblical view of salvation as deliverance into a good and broad land, a spacious land, a new heaven and a new earth. Put another way, black churches have addressed their ministries both to the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery. To be sure, in the broad sweep of black church history, both themes are present and prominent, sometimes complementing and at other times competing with one another for dominance as the black church wrestles through the dilemmas and double consciousness of its own identity and sense of mission. Yet, because the soteriological imagination of the American churches has tended to be largely individualistic in a way that mirrors the culture itself, and because black churches have not been sufficiently self-reflective about the theological meaning of their own distinctive history and liberationist heritage of radical protest, a privatistic piety emphasizing the salvation of individual souls while eschewing the hard political work of transforming society tends to be the default position even for black churches. Because it too is a largely evangelical church, it is not too difficult to see how the black church, caught up in the unexamined political presuppositions of the American evangelical ethos, can become self-alienated from its own liberationist legacy. I was listening to Skip Gates at an event last night, and he was saying that the black middle class has quadrupled in size since Dr. King's death, and yet the rate of childhood poverty among black children is virtually equal to the rate of 1968, the year Dr. King was assassinated. And so with increasing middle class upward mobility of much of its membership in the decades after the civil rights movement, increasing alienation from the black church's revolutionary sensibilities, the black church risks the wholesale abandonment of its work of freedom fighting as even relevant to its Christian identity and praxis. I believe it was the Kerner report that said that there were two Americas. Today there are two black Americas. And amidst the serenity and safety of the sanctuaries of our churches, the focus too often is upon souls alone, because the endangered black bodies warehoused in America's prison industrial complex, unlike those oppressed during the era of Jim Crow segregation, are both out of sight and out of mind. Yet this kind of truncated view of salvation has always been dangerous, particularly for oppressed people. Its tragic political implications can be clearly seen in a letter written by George Whitefield, a prominent preacher during the First Great Awakening and a fierce advocate of saving the souls of slaves while keeping their bodies in physical bondage. He gloats in a letter written to a friend that near 50 Negroes came to give me thanks for what God had done to their souls. I believe masters and mistresses will shortly see that Christianity will not make their Negroes worse slaves. To the contrary, African American Christians resisted this truncated view of salvation, embracing instead a view of divine liberation both from the slavery of sin and the sin of slavery. Evidenced in the spirituals, the prominence and distinctive hermeneutical deployment of the Exodus motif, subversive survival ethics and strategies like putting on old massa, and other elements of the slave tradition is an oppositional piety whose distance from that expressed by Whitefield was wide and deep, representing what Dwight Hopkins calls the co-constitution of the black self. Howard Thurman said, by some amazing but vastly creative spirituality, the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned in his midst. African American slaves rightly understood that a narrow individualistic conception of Christian salvation and personal piety could never provide an effective moral response to slavery. Their descendants, indeed all freedom-loving people, should know that such a distorted piety can never adequately address itself to the systemic injustices of America's prison industrial complex, in many ways a postmodern mutation of the same white supremacist virus that gave birth to slavery and Jim Crow segregation. But if the privatistic piety of the churches presents a theological barrier, it is further complicated by the moral and social stigma attached to inmates, particularly the guilty, and the ethical dilemmas and complexities therein. Stigma. Given the investments of corporate and political interests in the colossal public policy failure that is mass incarceration, it is clear, as Michelle Alexander has argued, that nothing short of a massive and sustained movement will undo it and move the nation in a different direction. But how do you build an effective social movement, particularly among church persons, when the primary subjects of its advocacy are those stigmatized by the label convicted felon? It is one thing to stand up for Rosa Parks, whom Martin Luther King Jr. called one of the most respected people in the Negro community. It is quite another to fight for the basic human rights and human dignity of persons whose individual behavior may well be deplorable and who bear some culpability for their condition. Indeed, this is part of the conundrum posed by racial bias in the criminal justice system. In a world where ordinary black people must still navigate every day the racial politics of respectability, bearing the burden of being, in the words of that old folk saying, a credit to the race, those who find themselves caught up in the criminal justice system have not kept their side of the deal. If many outside of the African American community view these young black men who track through the courtrooms of every major American city every single day with fear and contempt, the truth is many within their own families and churches harbor feelings of disappointment, anger, and ambivalence. They are the ultimate outsiders, stigmatized as both black and criminal, two words that have long been interchangeable in the Western imagination. The historical interchangeability of the two, black and criminal, is ironically and tragically embodied in the fact that even upon release from prison, many of the same discriminations suffered upon black people during segregation are the lifelong lot of convicted felons, including discrimination in employment, housing, and voting. No matter how long ago the crime occurred or what heroic efforts may have been put forth to achieve personal redemption, They are reminded each time they are presented with an application of employment or other paths of inclusion into the marketplace of the black mark that hangs over their lives. But no group is more stigmatized than those persons on death row. After years of steady decline and presumptive death by many criminologists, the death penalty reemerged as part of a conservative backlash in the years immediately following the civil rights movement. In a real sense, it is the final fail-safe of white supremacy. For the data clearly show that its use ensures that in the final analysis, the lives of white people are to be regarded as more valuable than the lives of black people. That is why the race of the victim, more than anything else, determines the likelihood that the punishment will be death by execution. And if the victim is white and the presumed perpetrator is African American, the symbolic power of condemning that cardinal trespass is every bit as important as ensuring that the actual African American who committed the offense is executed. That is still true decades after the era of lynching became exceedingly clear to me a few years ago during my public advocacy for death row inmate Troy Davis. By the time I met Troy Davis and became involved with his case, both as pastor to him and his family, and a public advocate for the sparing of his life, he had been on death row for nearly 20 years. He and I were born in the same year. He was convicted in 1991 for the 1989 slaying of a young police officer named Mark Allen McPhail in our hometown of Savannah, Georgia. It was 2008, and we held the first of several rallies for him at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Davis's case had already gained national and international attention and brought together unlikely allies in the struggle to save his life. It embodied so clearly all that is wrong with America's deployment of the death penalty that even death penalty proponents, like William Sessions, former head of the FBI, and Bob Barr, conservative Georgia congressman with whom I disagree about 90% of the time, stood in agreement with liberals like President Jimmy Carter and Congressman John Lewis against the execution of Troy Davis. The trial provided no physical evidence in support of Davis's conviction. No murder weapon was ever found. DNA evidence or surveillance tapes were ever produced. And in a trial based largely on witness testimony, 7 of the 9 witnesses, some reporting experiences of police abuse, changed or recanted or materially changed their testimony. On 3 separate occasions, Davis's execution was stayed within minutes of his death. Finally, I stood in a prison yard with his family and hundreds of others one fall night, September 21st, 2011, as Troy Davis, with whom I had visited 2 days before for one last time in his jail cell, was stretched out and strapped to a gurney bearing an eerie resemblance to a crucifix and executed in my name as a citizen of the state of Georgia by lethal injection. In the years that I have continued to fight for Davis and others like him, for the soul of a nation scarred by deep contradictions in the criminal justice system, and for the lives of young black men like Trayvon Martin, who was tragically endangered and murdered by the stigma of blackness as criminality, I have often reminded myself that I preach each week in memory of a death row inmate convicted on trumped-up charges at the behest of religious authorities and executed by the state without the benefit of due process. The cross, the Roman Empire's method of execution reserved for subversives, is a symbol of stigma and shame. Yet the early followers of Jesus embraced the scandal of the cross, calling it the power of God. To tell that story is to tell the story of stigmatized human beings. It is to embrace the complicated intersection between religion and human rights. To embrace the cross is to bear witness to the truth and power of God, subverting human assumptions about truth and power, pointing beyond the tragic limits of a given moment toward the promise of the resurrection. It is to see what an imprisoned exile of a persecuted community saw as he captured in Scripture the vision and hope of a new heaven and a new earth. But because that hard work involves both serious critical reflection and sustained revolutionary praxis, it is a project well served by the bridging of the yawning chasm between black theology and the black church. Ironically, the explosive and unprecedented growth of America's prison industrial complex, in practice, the clearest and perhaps the most consequential incarnation of racial oppression in post-racial America, and the growing divide between black theology and the black church have occurred roughly during the same period. Holding each other in suspicion and increasingly at arm's length over the last 30 years, black theology and the black church have not said much to one another, and neither has had much to say about what Michelle Alexander rightly characterizes as the new Jim Crow. While acknowledging their distinctive roles, I submit that the increasing distance between the black church and black theology and the deafening silence of the black church with respect to this and other issues in the public square are not unrelated. Born fighting for freedom, the black church is the living, countervailing conscience of American Christian piety. Emerging in the wake of the civil rights movement, black theology as a movement represents the radical side of the black church. As a radical theology, it is a liberationist faith questioning itself, a principled critic of the church from within the church, asking anew in each Sitzenleben whether the church in proclamation and praxis is living out its liberationist vocation. But with the demise of the NCBC, an organization of theologians and pastors working together, and a significant institutional site for the actual doing of black theology in its early days, black theology has become increasingly academic in its focus, and the black church has become increasingly conservative. The latter has lost its mind as black pastors and their churches become theologically self-absorbed, preaching an uncritical faith of individual prosperity while giving in to the stealthy pietistic rhetoric of conservative evangelicalism, not recognizing the critical distance between the presuppositions of the latter and their own countervailing heritage of liberation. Meanwhile, the former has lost its heart, the will to actually change the world. As black and womanist scholars gather at the American Academy of Religion, the Society for the Study of Biblical Literature, the Society for the Study of Black Religion, all fine institutions, and other regular enclaves of the Guild seeking professional acclamation and tenure. I submit that the institutional life of each is a far cry from its revolutionary origins. Meanwhile, the black body is once again quite literally trapped at the center of what Gunnar Myrdal characterized in 1944 as the American dilemma, viewed essentially as a problem. Formerly enslaved black bodies and lynched black bodies and segregated black bodies are now stopped, frisked, searched, handcuffed, incarcerated, executed, paroled, probated, released, but never emancipated black bodies. There is no more important test to the character of the American churches in general, and black churches and black theology in particular, given their self-understanding and liberationist claims, than their response to this human rights nightmare unfolding on our watch. If white theologians, pastors, and the churches they serve will not raise their voices in a serious way to the struggle of dismantling the prison industrial complex, then they will have proven that they are every bit as much invested in the logic and privilege of white supremacy as their predecessors in the era of chattel slavery and Jim Crow segregation. But if black theology and the black church will not give themselves over to this newest incarnation of the struggle to save black bodies, then they will have lost their soul and reason for being. And if that is true, both deserve to die. That is why it is urgent that black and womanist theologians and black pastors convene now a new conversation and commence a new moment of risk-taking dialogue and praxis so that a new and militant church preaching deliverance to the captives might be born again. Their lives and the soul of the nation depend on it.